people. Fantastic. My people. We are gathered here. This is great. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And I want to thank Ann Paget and Parnassus for being my hosts, and the Blair people, and every last one of you. I am going to read some poems, and if you have some questions, we can entertain them. And I thought I'm going to read some new poems and then some older ones and newer ones, so it'll be better than worse, then better again, and worse. But I'm not going to tell you which is which. So I want to read a poem. You know, I came across, I do enjoy reading in public, and I enjoy reading by myself. But I came across this quote from Terry Eagleton, who's a really interesting critic and writer, and he was trying to define writing. Well, if you think about it, that's hard to do, to come up with a definition of this big thing, writing. But he came up with this, which seems pretty good, but it made me feel, I question my life in a way. It says, writing, what is writing? Writing is language which can function perfectly well in the physical absence of its author. And I thought, well, what am I giving readings for? And apparently I'm not necessary. But so here's a poem about the reader. So I'm usually trying to summon up the reader's presence in a poem, and this one I do it pretty shamelessly. It's called You Reader. I wonder how you, let me start with, put some glasses on, it's always, I mean, you're just blurry, but that's okay. No, I can see you. So it's called You Reader. I wonder how you are going to feel when you find out that I wrote this instead of you. That it was I who got up early to sit in the kitchen and mention with a pen the rain-soaked windows, the ivy wallpaper, and the goldfish circling in its bowl. Go ahead and turn aside, bite your lip, and tear out the page. But listen, it was just a matter of time before one of us happened to notice the unlit candles and the clock humming on the wall. Plus, nothing happened that morning. A song on the radio, a car whistling along the road outside. And I was only thinking about the shakers of salt and pepper that were standing side by side on a placemat. I wondered if they had become friends after all these years, or if they were still strangers to one another, like you and I, who managed to be known and unknown to each other at the same time. Me at this table with a bowl of pears, you leaning in a doorway somewhere near some blue hydrangeas, reading this. If you throw the blue hydrangeas in at the end, then it's really good. Now this is something, a phenomenon that not many people know about, but I think most of you people do know about. It's the phenomenon of the Tennessee fainting goats, right? So many of you have heard of this, right? If not here, when? Where? So I heard about this only some months ago, and I grabbed a pen immediately. And this is called Down on the Farm. Whenever the conversation turns to the subject of Tennessee fainting goats, the question that always comes up is why? Are they so squeamish that they faint like Victorian ladies whenever the farmer uses language unbecoming a gentleman? Or is it catching, one goat fainting because he sees another one fainting? But that still leaves open the question of what makes the first goat faint. Does the memory of having keeled over one morning make one keel over again? Are they in love? Or is it all just too much? No one seems to know for sure, but it's something to think about when I'm trying to get to sleep at night, or when I'm looking out a window at the barn and the fenced-in pastures beyond. To see a goat stiffen before pitching over on its side with a thump is truly unnerving. But when he rises in a minute or two as if from the dead and goes back to munching with his head down in the sweet grass on these hillsides, then everything seems okay again, just like before. Thank you. Here's a little poem, only just 9 lines long, about a smaller creature. I remember when I first went to Europe, when I went to France for the first time, when I was pretty young, I'd see, like, that's a French bird. That's like a French cow. And they all seemed to be identified with the country they were in. And this is just called Irish Spider. It was well worth traveling this far just to sit in a box of sunlight by a window in a cottage with a cup of steaming tea, and to watch an Irish spider waiting at the center of his dewy web, pretending to be just any spider at all, a spider without a nation, but not fooling me for a minute. Say, a second wave of laughter there. It's a rare thing. I was reading, I'll just tell you a little bit about the circumstances of some of these poems. This one came out of reading, I was reading Elizabeth Bishop's collected poems. And on 2 facing pages, she has 2 poems. One of them is called Sleeping on the Ceiling. And the other one's called Sleeping Upside Down, I think. Anyway, they're both odd ways to sleep. And I thought I would make things just a little realistic, and I wrote a poem called Sleeping on My Side. So, now the interesting thing about this poem for me in writing it is that about 6 lines in, I realized, or the poem had said, do you realize I want to be a sonnet? And so I said, sure, okay, we can do that. And so I didn't go back and change the beginning, so after about 6 lines, the poem becomes more and more sonnet-like. And then at the end is really a sonnet ending. So it's an emerging form. Sleeping on my side. Every night, no matter where I am, when I lie down, I turn my back on half the world. At home is the East I ignore, with its theaters and silverware, as I face the adventurous West. But when I'm on the road in some hotel's room, 213 or 402, I could be pointed anywhere, yet I hardly care, as long as you are there, facing the other way, so we are defended in all degrees. And my left ear is pressing down, as if listening for hoofbeats in the ground. Thank you. Thank you very much. And here's a poem. Oh, do you know what a snood is? A couple of you? Yeah, it's probably more people know about Tennessee fainting goats than a snood. A snood is sort of a pouch, right? Women originally wore their hair kind of bundled up it kind of fell down the back a little bit like that. Well, this has kind of caught on with some hipsters in Brooklyn. I've noticed this. And these guys have adopted the snood. Now, the thing is, I'm pretty sure if they knew it was called a snood, they would take it off and let their hair do what it wants to do. But anytime I see one, I just wearing a snood, I just, under my breath, I say, nice snood there. So that's the only troublesome word or odd word in the poem. And the poem is called Safe Travels. Every time Gulliver travels, into another chapter of Gulliver's Travels. I marvel at how well-traveled he is, despite his incurable gullibility. I don't enjoy traveling anymore because, for instance, I still don't know the difference between a bloke and a chap, and I'm embarrassed whenever I have to hold out a palm of loose coins to a cashier as if I were feeding a pigeon in the park. Like Proust, I see only trouble if I leave my room, which is not lined with cork, only sheets of wallpaper featuring orange flowers and little green vines. Of course, anytime I want, I can travel in my imagination, but only as far as Toronto, where some graduate students with goatees and snoods are translating my poems into Canadian. Thanks a lot. Now this is a poem about, it's about a question that bubbles up into your head occasionally. And I'm quite sure it bubbles into a lot of people's heads, if only because there is actually an Arabic word for this, which I'll tell you in a minute. But it's the question. A question comes up in your head, and you really kind of just don't want to dwell on it. And the question is, who goes first? A friend of mine a while back said he couldn't. We were talking about what kept us up at light at night. I mentioned the Tennessee Fainting Goats, of course. And then he said that it was he kept wondering which Everly brother was going to go first. And so, in Arabic, the word, I'll mispronounce the word, it's Ya Berniz, or Ya Berni, and it means the declaration to someone of the hope that you will die before the other one. A formal declaration. Ya Berni, it literally means you bury me. Anyway, sorry, the poem is called Me First. We often fly in the sky together, and we're always okay. There's our luggage now, waiting for us on the carousel. And we drive lots of places in all manner of hectic traffic, yet here we are, pulling in the driveway again. So many opportunities to die together, but no meteor has hit our house. No tornado has lifted us into its funnel. The odds say then that one of us will go before the other, like heading off into a heavy snowstorm, leaving the other one behind to stand in the kitchen or lie on the bed under the fan. So why not let me, the older one, go first? I don't want to see you everywhere as I wait for the snow to stop before setting out with a crooked stick calling your name. So, there's only one word in here that's just a little uncommon. It's mulishness, which just means stubborn, acting like a mule, being stubborn. And the poem is called Imperial Garden. It's just a Chinese restaurant. You're all picturing an imperial garden here. Imperial Garden. And I'll use these little air quotes a couple times. Imperial Garden. It was at the end of dinner, the two of us in a red booth maintaining our silence, when I decided to compose a message for the fortune cookie you were about to receive. Avoid mulishness when choosing a position on the great board game of life. That was my wordy, mean-spirited gift to the treasury of ancient wisdom. But while we waited for the cookies, the slices of oranges, and the inescapable pot of watery tea, I realized that by mulishness, I meant your refusal to let me have my own way every time I wanted it. I watched you looking off to the side, your massive dark hair, your profile softened by lamplight, and then I made up a fortune cookie for myself. He who acts like a jerk on an island of his own creation, will have only the horizon for a friend. I seem to be getting worse at this, I thought. As the cookies arrived at the table, along with the orange slices and a teapot painted with tigers peering out menacingly from the undergrowth. The restaurant was quiet then. The waiter returned to looking out at the street. A zither whimpered in the background. And we turned to our cookies, crumbling the brittle shells, then rolling into little balls the tiny scrolls of our fortunes, before dropping them, unread, into our cups of tea, a little good luck thing we'd been doing ever since we met. This has a happy ending. I bet you some of you have been to San Miguel de Allende and in Mexico. So I was there last year, and this came out of it. It's called the Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende. The Symphony Orchestra of San Miguel de Allende is not made up of the usual instruments. Instead of brass, strings, and woodwinds, there are church bells, roosters, doves, and barking dogs, all of which predate the horn, the violin, and the oboe, notably the rooster, who crowed even before the time of Christ. The orchestra plays all day and into the night, but the music is most vibrant in the early morning, when much of the audience is still in bed and not distracted by their jobs and errands as they will be later in the day. At first, as I listened from my canopied bed, it sounded more like noise, a noisy riot of nonsense, until I imagined a gigantic score written centuries ago by the Mozart of Mexico, the genius who decided that those dogs should come in just after the 32 gongs of a solemn bell, who had the doves modulate into an adagio, and who added a rest here and there where the rooster should pause, but not for long. Are we not seekers of order, I thought, as when we examine the lines in our palms or connect the dots of the stars to form a bear in the sky, then why not lie here a little longer before rising from our slumber to ponder the greater meaning of this composition for dogs, roosters, doves, and bells? The dogs are barking to be fed. The roosters are beckoning us to the hen house where 3 eggs are still warm in the straw. But the doves are mourning our losses, and the bells are there to remind us of God. So I'll read a couple of poems from this new book, The Rain in Portugal. I thought it was a actually hilarious title when I made it up. You know, like all things, it kind of wears itself out after a while. But so this is a poem just called 1960. 1960. In the old joke, the marriage counselor tells the couple who never talks anymore to go to a jazz club, because at a jazz club, everyone talks during the bass solo. But of course, no one starts talking just because of a bass solo, or any other solo for that matter. The quieter bass solo just reveals the people in the club who have been talking all along, the ones you can hear on some well-known recordings. Bill Evans, for example, who is opening a new door into the piano while some guy chats up his date at one of the little tables in the back. I have listened to that album so many times, I can anticipate the moment of his drunken laugh, as if it were a strange note in the tune. And so, anonymous man, you have become part of my listening, your romance, a romance lost in the past, and a reminder somehow that every member of that trio has died since then, and maybe so have you, and sadly, maybe she. There's kind of a magnetic north in poetry, and it points to death, basically. So almost every poem kind of wants to go in that direction. And not a bad idea to just let it go in that direction, but sometimes you have to pull it back. And I've written quite a few poems about dogs, but we have two cats in the house now, a black one and a white one. And don't tell me one of them's smarter than the other one. Because they're very sensitive. But one of them got into a poem here. But one of them, we have a strange little relationship. She doesn't jump up on my chest when I come home, but like dogs do. But my mother, when I was a little toddler, said to me something I thought was brilliant. She said, well, the reason the dogs and cats don't talk is that they don't have anything to say. But this particular cat looks like she has something to say, but she just forgot it. And that's the only way I can take her expression. So this is called Lucky Cat. It's a law as immutable as the ones governing bodies in motion and bodies at rest, that a cat picked up will never stay in the place where you choose to set it down. I bet you'd be happy on the sofa, or this hassock, or this knitted throw pillow, are a few examples of bets you are bound to lose. The secret of winning, I have found, is never to bet against the cat, but on the cat, preferably with another human being, who, unlike the cat, is likely to be carrying money. And I cannot think of a better time to thank our cat for her obedience to that law, thus turning me into a consistent winner. She's a pure black one, quite impossible to photograph, and prone to disappearing into the night, or even into the thin shadows of noon. Such an amorphous blob of blackness is she. The only way to tell she is approaching is to notice the two little yellow circles of her eyes, then only one circle when she is walking away with her tail raised high. Something like the lantern signals of Paul Revere. American silversmith, galloping patriot. Now, when we talk about poetry in class, we talk about the themes. It's a search for the father, or the theme of elegiac grief over someone who's died, or joy, whatever. But when poets are writing the poem, all the poems are about one thing basically, and that is, how do I get out of here? How do I find an ending? How can I come to an ending? And most of these poems fit on one page. So the ending is coming up soon. Even when you start it, you're wondering about the ending. So the question is, how do I find a place where I don't want to say anymore and you don't want to hear anymore? So we have this kind of settlement, and that kind of a nice settlement. So, Paul Revere, the last thing on my mind when I started writing about this cat was Paul Revere, but it just occurred to me. But as soon as it occurred to me, yes, that's the eureka, that's the ending. So, and there's another poem in here I might read where Ferlinghetti comes to my aid, and he resolves the poem by his mere appearance. This is a poem called Only Child. There are probably some of you out there. You don't have to identify yourself. But I think there's a signing afterwards, so you can come up to the front because you deserve it. Right? You're, you're special. So I wanted long to address this subject. Only child. I never wished for a sibling, boy or girl. Center of the universe. I had the back of my parents' car all to myself. I could look out one window, then slide over to the other window without any quibbling over territorial rights. And whenever I played a game on the floor of my bedroom, it was always my turn. Not until my parents entered their 90s did I long for a sister, a nurse I named Mary, who worked in a hospital 5 minutes away from their house. And it would drop everything, even a thermometer, whenever I called. Be there in a jiff and on my way were two of her favorite expressions. And now that the parents are dead, I wish I could meet Mary for coffee every now and then at that Italian place with the blue awning, where we would sit and reminisce even on rainy days. I would gaze into her green eyes and see my parents, my mother looking out of Mary's right eye, and my father staring out of her left, which would remind me of what an odd duck I was as a child, a little prince and a loner, who would break off from his gang of friends on a Saturday and find a hedge to hide behind. And I would tell Mary all about that too, and never embarrass her by asking about her non-existence. And maybe we would have another espresso and a pastry, and I would always pay the bill and walk her home. It's amazing to cause emotional reactions for imaginary characters, but that's what English teachers do all the time. The same Terry Eagleton wrote about. He imagined some some functionary in the great bureaucratic Department of Education in Washington, and he's going through a bunch of papers, and he pulls out this paper, and it turns out that there are all these people called professors, and all they do is go into classrooms and talk about people that don't exist. Like Huckleberry Finn or whatever. And something must be done about this. We're paying them to do this. Just to go back to the cat for a minute, a little poem, because they do have another side to them besides being cute. It's a little poem called Predator. It takes only a minute to bury a wren, 2 trowels full of dirt, and he's in. The cat at the threshold sits longer in doubt, deciding whether to stay in or go out. And, well, here's a poem called Greece, and it's really, it's about monuments falling apart. It's about ruins. Greece. The ruins were taking their time falling apart. Stones that once held up other stones now scattered on top of one another, as if many centuries had to pass before they hearkened to the call of gravity. The few pillars still upright had nervous looks on their faces, teetering there in the famous sunlight which descended on the grass and the disheveled stones. And that is precisely how the bathers looked after we had changed at the Cliffside Hotel and made our way down to the rocky beach, pillars of flesh in bathing suits, 2 pillars tossing a colorful ball, 1 pillar lying with his arm around another, even a tiny pillar with a pail and shovel, all deaf to a voice as old as the surf itself. Is not poetry a megaphone held up to the whispering lips of death? I wrote before capping my pen and charging into the waves with a shout. And This is a poem about, I'd say, about superstition. And I'm very superstitious about superstitions. But if you don't tell me one, because I'll adopt it. So I was in Ireland a while ago, and some years ago, someone pointed out it's very, very, very unlucky to accept the salt when someone's passing you the salt. They have to set it down, then you pick it up. And conversely, never pass the salt to anyone, always set it down near them and they'll pick it up. I don't know why, but you can try to catch me at this, but you won't. Others have tried, but no. Put it down. Put it on the table, come on. So this kind of begins with another kind of superstition and ends with a kind of superstition, and it's called genuflection. The moment I was told about the Irish habit of tipping the cap to the first magpie one encounters in the course of a day and saying to him, "Good morning, sir," I knew I would be in for the long haul. No one should be made to count the number of magpies I have treated with such deference, such magpie protocol. The latest being today, when I spotted one perched on the railing of a fence along the crooked road from the house. This was a bird well out of its usual climate, according to the map in my bird book, a stray, a rebel, if you will, not flocking with birds of its feather, rather flying to a different drummer who beats his drum with the tiny bones of birds. But why wouldn't every bird merit a greeting, a nod, or at least a blink to clear the eyes, a wave to the geese overhead, maybe an inquiry of a nervous chickadee, a salute in the dark to the hoot of an owl? And as for the great blue heron, as motionless in profile by the shore as a drawing by a Delphic priest, will anything serve short of a genuflection? As a boy, I worked on that move, gliding in a black cassock and white surplice inside the border of an altar rail, then stopping to descend, one knee touching the cool marble floor, palms pressed together in prayer, right thumb crossed over left, and never the other way around. So I'll read some poems from this book here, or this here book. It's another way of saying it. It's amazing how that word can change your whole take on someone. It's a weird language, English. You have to, the only way to really appreciate it is teaching it, I think. I mean, for instance, you have to explain to someone who's learning English at some point, you might explain that to take care of someone means to nurture them and protect them and help them, and it also means to kill them. I'll take care of them, boss. Don't worry. You know? So hard to explain that to someone. So here's a poem about an everyday experience called Cheerios. One bright morning in a restaurant in Chicago, as I waited for my eggs and toast, I opened the Tribune only to discover that I was the same age as Cheerios. Indeed, I was a few months older than Cheerios, for today the newspaper announced was the 70th birthday of Cheerios, whereas mine had occurred earlier in the year. Already I could hear them whispering behind my stooped and threadbare back, "Why, that dude's older than Cheerios." The way they used to say, "Why, that's as old as the hills." Only the hills are much older than Cheerios or any American breakfast cereal. And more noble and enduring are the hills, I surmised, as a bar of sunlight illuminated my orange juice. So now you know something about me anyway. Well, this poem is about the situation as an adult speaking to an adolescent, or trying to communicate something to an adolescent. And it's called To My Favorite 17-Year-Old High School Girl. Do you realize that if you had started building the Parthenon on the day you were born, you would be all done in only one more year? Of course, you couldn't have done that alone, so never mind. You're fine just as you are. You are loved for simply being yourself. But did you know that at your age, Judy Garland was pulling down $150,000 a picture? Joan of Arc was leading the French army to victory, and Blaise Pascal had cleaned up his room? No, wait, he's the one who invented the calculator. Of course, there'll be time for all that later in your life, after you come out of your room and begin to blossom, or at least pick up all your socks. For some reason, I keep remembering that Lady Jane Grey was Queen of England when she was only 15. But then she was beheaded, so never mind her as a role model. But a few centuries later, when he was your age, Franz Schubert was doing the dishes for his family. But that did not keep him from composing 2 symphonies, 4 operas, and 2 complete masses as a youngster. But of course, that was in Austria at the height of Romantic lyricism, not here in the suburbs of Cleveland. Frankly, who cares if Annie Oakley was a crack shot at 15, or if Maria Callas debuted as Tosca at 17? We think you're special by just being you, playing with your food and staring into space. By the way, I lied about Schubert doing the dishes, but that doesn't mean he never helped out around the house. Thank you. She didn't talk to me for 2 years. Bless her heart. She wasn't talking much to me before that, so. You've probably come across poems that are based very explicitly on on previous poems. So much so that the second poem is a tribute to the first poem, and there's a way of going about this that gives signals what you're actually up to. The first thing is you use the same title as the earlier poem, and then after that you write the expression after, and then you name the poet whose poem you're doing something to. So after Neruda, after Coleridge, whatever. There's a lovely, sorry about this little cough here. There's a lovely poem by the Chinese poet Li Po called Drinking Alone. And I really love the poem, and I thought I'd write something, a version of that. I thought, well, you have enough experience drinking alone, so that's okay, that's part of it. But I went through the etiquette, wrote after Li Po, and then kind of pulled a blank. But since that's never stopped me before, I forged ahead. Drinking alone, after Li Po. This is not after Li Po in the way the state is after me for neglecting to pay all my taxes, nor the way I am after the woman in front of me on the long line at the post office. Li Po, I am not saying after you as I stand holding open one of the heavy glass doors that divide the centuries in a long corridor of glass doors. No, the only way this is after you is in the way they say, it's just one thing after another. Like the way I will pause to raise a glass of wine to you after I finish writing this poem. So let me get back to sitting in the wind alone among the pines with a pencil in my hand. After all, you had your turn, and mine will soon be done. Then someone else will sit here after me. This poem starts off with an interesting phenomenon. It's called the sandhill cranes of Nebraska. That's one of their flyways. Maybe some of you have actually seen them, but that's the Midwestern flyway they use. The sandhill cranes of Nebraska. Too bad you weren't here 6 months ago, was a lament I heard on my visit to Nebraska. You could have seen the astonishing spectacle of the sandhill cranes, thousands of them feeding and even dancing on the shores of the Platte River. There was no point in pointing out the impossibility of my being there then because I happened to be somewhere else, but I nodded and put on a look of mild disappointment, if only to be part of the commiseration. It was the exact same look I remember wearing about 6 months ago in Georgia, when I was told that I had just missed this spectacular annual outburst of azaleas, brilliant against the green backdrop of spring. And the same in Vermont 6 months before that, when I arrived shortly after the magnificent foliage had gloriously peaked, Mother Nature, as she is called, having touched the hills with her many-colored brush, a phenomenon that occurs, like the others, around the same time every year, when I am apparently off in another state, stuck in a motel lobby with the local newspaper and a styrofoam cup of coffee, busily missing God knows what. Thank you. The great poet Howard Nemeroff, who was poet laureate, made up a word for this stuff. It was in a dictionary of new words that a lot of writers were asked to contribute to, not to be funny, but to actually try to identify what a linguist would call a hole in the language, where you need a word. Now, like the word. And if you're eating in a Mexican or Indian restaurant, and you say, this is really hot, you don't know if it's hot because it's cooked hot or is it the spice is hot. So you need a word there. If you'd like to make one up, go ahead. But anyway, he made up the verb, a verb to azaleate. And to azaleate means to commiserate needlessly with some, or commiserate with some local, with a visitor about some local phenomenon that they will miss because they're leaving too early, or they did miss because they got here too late or something. So that's what you're doing when you're doing that. You're azaleating. Well, I was saying we can't often avoid the subject of death, but other times we just take it head on. So this is called Grave. What do you think of my new glasses? I asked as I stood under a shade tree before the joined grave of my parents. And what followed was a long silence that descended on the rows of the dead and on the fields and the woods beyond. One of the 100 kinds of silence, according to the Chinese belief, each one distinct from the others, and the differences being so faint, only a few special monks were able to tell them all apart. They make you look very scholarly, I heard my mother say, once I lay down on the ground and pressed an ear into the soft grass. Then I rolled over and pressed my other ear to the ground, the ear my father likes to speak into, but he would say nothing, and I could not find a silence among the 100 Chinese silences that would fit the one he created, even though I was the one who had just made up the business of the 100 Chinese silences, the silence of the night boat and the silence of the lotus, cousin to the silence of the temple bell, only deeper and softer, like petals at its farthest edges. See, my father was a practical joker. He would kid me all the time, so I tried to get back at him posthumously, but still it counts. Here are two little tiny poems. One kind of goes back to the just looking here, goes back to the 17-year-old girl, to her age group anyway, and the poem is called. I'm just fumbling here. The poem is called "Oh My God," with an explanation point. It's a little. It's only this long, and the speaker is a very innocent, very naive, gullible guy. Oh my God, not only in church and nightly by their bedsides do young girls pray these days. Wherever they go, prayer is woven into their talk like a bright thread of awe. Even at the pedestrian mall, outbursts of praise spring unbidden from their glossy lips. And this is a 4-line poem. When I get a book of poems, very few people, I think, read a book of poetry front to back. Editors, reviewers might. But I don't know what you do with it, but I usually get a book of someone's poems, and I just use it as a flip book. We used to have the cowboy in a last suit or something like that. But in this case, I'm just looking for a real short poem. I trust a poet more if he or she can write a short poem, and I think it's sort of a point of insertion into the whole book, maybe. So this is just 4 lines long, and the entire sense of the poem depends on this title. And there are poems for which the title is kind of icing on the cake or whatever, but some poems are nonsense without the title, and the title is Divorce. Divorce. Once 2 spoons in bed, now tined forks across a granite table, and the knives they have hired. Yeah, that's a terrible feeling. Well, we've heard from a cat, so let's hear from a dog. This is a little poem in which the dog is thinking, or just thinking to itself, thinking about its master. Not too much else to think about when you're a dog, I guess. And we were eavesdropping on the dog's thinking, his little meditation, and it's only 12 lines long, and the dog is thinking, and we're listening, and it's called "The Dog on His Master." As young as I look, I am growing older faster than he. 7-to-1 is the ratio, they tend to say. Whatever the number, I will pass him one day and take the lead, the way I do on our walks in the woods. And if this ever manages to cross his mind, it would be the sweetest shadow I have ever cast on snow or grass. That is a very sensitive dog right there. So here's another kind of a dog and a poem that's called "The Revenant." It's just a big word for a ghost that especially one that wants to come down and see you. Okay, the Revenant. I am the dog you put to sleep, as you like to call the needle of oblivion. Come back to tell you this simple thing. I never liked you. When I licked your face, I thought of biting off your nose. When I watched you toweling yourself dry, I wanted to leap and unman you with a snap. I resented the way you moved, your lack of animal grace, the way you would sit in a chair to eat, a napkin on your lap, a knife in your hand. I would have run away, but I was too weak, a trick you taught me, while I was learning to sit and heal, and greatest of insults, shake hands without a hand. I admit the sight of the leash would excite me, but only because it meant I was about to smell things that you had never touched. You do not want to believe this, but I have no reason to lie. I hated the car, hated the rubber toys, disliked your friends, and worse, your relatives. The jingling of my tags drove me mad. You always scratched me in the wrong place. All I ever wanted from you was food and fresh water in my metal bowls. While you slept, I watched you breathe as the moon rose in the sky. It took all of my strength not to raise my head and howl. Now I am free of the collar, free of the yellow raincoat, monogrammed sweater, the absurdity of your lawn. And that is all you need to know about this place, except what you already supposed, and are glad it did not happen sooner, that everyone here can read and write, the dogs in poetry, the cats and all the others in prose. Thank you. Here's just a little, no, I won't read that one. Let me read, this is out of season poem. This is a good poem to read in August, but it's about something kids make at camp in the summertime. And it's called The Lanyard. And the first stanza of the poem, I always try to be straightforward in the beginning of the poem. And I don't make any demands on you at the beginning. I make some demands on you with, like, Paul Revere, things of that nature. But I try to just get you in the poem. And so I devote the first stanza of this poem to just explaining how exactly the poem started rolling forward. The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the pale blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift from my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard, or wear one if that's what you did with them, but that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim. And I in turn presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education. And here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here I wish to say to her now is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very delicate and strange transaction there. But at camp, if you've ever been to camp, you're supposed to bring something back that you made with your own 2 hands. Then there was another option, I think it was an option, it was like a little piece of a circular tin, very malleable tin. And you just, this for the less skilled campers, you just take a hammer and bang the bejesus out of it and call it an ashtray. For Dad. An unidentifiable flying piece of tin. So I wanted to, read this poem here. It's a poem that I started, took a little pivot as I was writing it. But I wanted to write, just like writing about the cat, who never stays in this one place. I wanted to write this, I think I was watching old movies or something, and I wanted to write about the phenomenon of men who wore hats in the cities. And maybe your father wore or grandfather or whatever, but that habit, that fashion, died out around coterminous with the election of John Kennedy, because he didn't wear anything on his head. Who would with that hair? And he sort of put the hat business out of business. A woman came up to me after reading, and I had mentioned that same thing, and she said, do you know what, you talked about the hat, the Kennedy and all that, and she said, do you know what killed the paperweight? And audiences at readings, not you, but often not too stable. So I took a step back, and she said, air conditioning, right? So perfectly right. In offices in downtown New York, maybe, before air conditioning, you had fans, all the windows were wide open, and it was all paper, no computers. So their paperweight was an instrument of utility. You'd have to have them all around the place. But the air conditioning turned them into curios. So there is something, if you've learned nothing tonight but that. If the subject of paperweights comes up at the dinner table, you are prepared. So back to hats. So this is called The Death of the Hat. Once every man wore a hat. In the ashen newsreels, the avenues of cities are broad rivers flowing with hats. Ballparks swelled with thousands of straw hats, brims and bands, rows of men smoking and cheering in shirt sleeves. Hats were the law. They went without saying. You noticed a man in a crowd without a hat. You bought them from Adams or Dobbs, who branded your initials in gold on the inside band. Trolleys crisscrossed the city. Steamships sailed in and out of the harbor. Men with hats gathered on the docks. There was a person to block your hat and a hat-check girl to mind it while you had a drink or ate a steak with peas and a baked potato. In your office stood a hat rack. The day war was declared, everyone in the street was wearing a hat, and they were wearing hats when a ship loaded with men and women sank in the icy sea. My father wore one to work every day and returned home carrying the evening paper, the winter chill radiating from his overcoat. But today we go bareheaded into the winter streets, stand hatless on frozen platforms. Today the mailboxes on the roadside and the spruce trees behind the house wear cold white hats of snow. Mice scurry from the stone walls at night in their thin fur hats to eat the birdseed that has spilled. And now my father, after a life of work, wears a hat of earth, and on top of that, a lighter one of cloud and sky, a hat of wind. So we have a little more time, and I'll read just a few more poems. Here's one, I think with a helpful title, if you know who Art Blakey is. He's a jazz drummer. And the Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And the title is, I Chopped Some Parsley While Listening to Art Blakey's version of Three Blind Mice. And I start wondering how they came to be blind. If it was congenital, they could be brothers and sisters. And I think of the poor mother brooding over her sightless young triplets. Or was it a common accident? All three caught in a searing explosion, a firework perhaps. If not, if each came to his or her blindness separately, how did they ever manage to find one another? Would it not be difficult for a blind mouse to locate even one fellow mouse with vision, let alone two other blind ones? And how, in their tiny darkness, could they possibly have run after a farmer's wife? Or anyone else's wife, for that matter, not to mention why? Just so she could cut off their tails with a carving knife is the cynic's answer. But the thought of them without eyes, and now without tails, to trail through the moist grass, has the cynic who always lounges within me up off his couch and at the window, trying to hide the rising softness that he feels. By now, I am on to dicing an onion, which might account for the wet stinging in my own eyes, though Freddie Hubbard's mournful trumpet on Blue Moon, which happens to be the next cut, cannot be said to be making matters any better. and that is the next cut, oddly enough. Most of these poems are written in one sitting, mainly because I don't know what the end's going to be, and I have to figure it out. So you know Petrarch, right? Who was sort of the Italian 13th century medieval Italian poet who more or less is credited at least with inventing the sonnet, and then it was imported into England later and perfected by Shakespeare. But it's still written. So there's a poem called Sonnet. All we need is 14 lines. Well, 13 now. And after this one, just a dozen. To launch a little ship on love's storm-tossed seas. Then only 10 more left, like rows of beans. How easily it goes, unless you get Elizabethan and insist the iambic bongos must be played, and rhymes positioned at the ends of lines, one for every station of the cross. But hang on here while we make the turn into the final 6, where all will be resolved, where longing and heartache will find an end, where Laura will tell Petrarch to put down his pen, take off those crazy medieval tights, blow out the lights, and come at last to bed. The sonnet was basically panting. You know, there was no sex in the sonnet. It was driven by courtly love, which meant the woman was elevated too high to have sex with, something like that. But so I thought they should get together. Those two. So here's a poem I wrote some time ago, but more and more people seem to like it. It's called Forgetfulness. And Patrick Susskind, the guy who wrote Perfume, wrote an article called Literary Amnesia, and he talked about forgetting his books. He was in his study with the book-lined study, floor to ceiling, and he realized that he remembered almost nothing of these books he had read. At this point in my life, I have an imaginary bookshelf in my head, like about that long, and every time I read a new book, it knocks the other one off, and the shelf itself is getting smaller. So anyway, so Forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if one by one the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall. Well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. And I think I'll finish with, this poem. It's, well, you remember the 20th century, right? Or parts of it, little shards of it. Well, recall with me the habit we had of the 20th century of dealing with this amorphous thing called the past. Remember, we used to divide time into little decades like this and talk about the 60s and, it's like an 80s thing and all that stuff. So very glibly and knowledgeably, we would give these little decades kind of personalities, and then we'd, but there always seemed to be a bit of bittersweet in the memory, as if we wanted to just stay in the 60s or 70s forever in some sort of time loop. And we were all, I think, made to feel nostalgic about the missing, the goneness of these periods. So that's why the poem is called Nostalgia. Remember the 1340s? We were doing a dance called the catapult. You always wore brown, the color craze of the decade. And I was draped in one of those capes that were popular, the ones with unicorns and pomegranates and needlework. Everyone would pause for beer and onions in the afternoon. And at night, we would play a game called Find the Cow. Everything was hand-lettered back then, not like today. Where has the summer of 1572 gone? Brocade and sonnet marathons were the rage. We used to dress up in the flags of rival baronies and conquer one another in cold rooms of stone. Out on the dance floor, we were all doing the struggle. While your sister practiced the Daphne all alone in her room. We borrowed the jargon of farriers for our slang. These days, language seems transparent, a badly broken code. The 1790s will never come again. Childhood was big. People would take walks to the very tops of hills and then write down what they saw in their journals without speaking. Our collars were high, our hats were extremely soft. We would surprise each other with alphabets made of twigs. It was a wonderful time to be alive, or even dead. I am very fond of the period between 1815 and 1821. Europe trembled while we sat still for our portraits. And I would love to return to 1901, if only for a moment. Time enough to wind up a music box and do a few dance steps. Or shoot me back to 1922 or 1941, or at least let me recapture the serenity of last month when we picked berries and glided through afternoons in a canoe. Even this morning would be an improvement over the present. I was in the garden then, surrounded by the hum of bees and the Latin names of flowers, watching the early light flash off the slanted windows of the greenhouse and silver the limbs on the rows of dark hemlocks. As usual, I was thinking about the moments of the past, letting my memory rush over them like water rushing over the stones on the bottom of a stream. I was even thinking a little about the future, that place where people are doing a dance we cannot imagine, a dance whose name we can only guess. Thank you. You're terrific. Thank you. Nothing like an audience that jumps for joy. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll tell you what I'm trying to do now that it's over. Basically, I'm trying to mix comic poems with serious poems. And if I sense that you're having too good a time, I try to get you laughing early, but then I sort of want to modulate that. And my aim is, I hope now that you're emotionally confused and disoriented. So that's the way I like to leave audiences. Well, after that admission, maybe you all want to just stand up and go. But so, are there any questions? I don't think we have microphones or anything, but I can repeat the question. Yeah. How have my poems changed over time? Not as much as you might think, considering how long I've been writing. You see, I didn't have a persona. That is to say, a kind of dependable tone, speaking voice, until I was in my 30s. Before then, I was writing poetry, and I was imitating a lot of poets, but I was imitating the wrong poets. And I was imitating them so devotedly that the result was really more like travesties of their work than intelligent imitations. And then when I was in my 30s, I started reading people like Philip Larkin and Kenneth Koch and other poets that made me realize that one could allow humor into poetry. I didn't think that was possible without, and it wasn't, without being consigned to a ghetto called light verse. And there's nothing wrong with that. I love Ogden Nash, but I didn't want to be a light verse poet. So I discovered this persona, and I would say the development has, I mean, I'm getting worse. I'm getting worse is the answer. Just be honest and go on to the next question. I don't know. Do you know anyone who's getting better? I don't. My friends aren't getting better, I'll tell you that. It's all deterioration. But I did find this persona, this kind of speaking voice, and he still sounds pretty much the same. You know, he's kind of a better version of me. He's an improvement on me, but he basically, he doesn't have a job. He doesn't, he doesn't have a past, really. There's not much autobiographical information in here. I mean, I had parents, but that's not a big revelation. So he just, he falls into these speculations. He looks out the window and something wiggy occurs to him. Well, that guy is the same, really. So it's more that I'm so attached to this persona that I've been resisting development. So that's a good question, and a short one too. I like that. Sir, and then you next. Yeah, well, about how to write with humor. Well, first of all, are you a funny guy? I mean, you just crack your friends up? Yeah. I don't think you can try to be humorous. I think you have to be humorous in your life, or have a humorous way of looking at things, and then allow that into the poetry. I don't think it can come out of the poetry through some decision to be humorous. Damn it, But you would learn to do that if it could be learned through imitation. And I'd recommend rather an anthology called Seriously Funny, which is a collection of fairly contemporary poems by poets who are funny, but they're funny with serious intent. It's not just a laugh riot. There's something else going on there. I don't know. There's something authentic about humor too, I think, because anyone can pretend to be serious, right? I mean, I'm pretending to be serious now, actually. But, you just go like this, really. I mean, if you've ever been in a classroom or been interviewed or had a job, you know it's to be serious. Committee meetings, I mean, everyone's, that's an awfully good point, Ted. And you just want to shoot yourself. So you can put on seriousness, but you can't put on humor. You can't pretend to be funny. You're either funny or you're not. So there's something actually reliable about it, even though it's supposed to be less than seriousness, right? Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish poet, said that tragedy is just underdeveloped comedy. That his feeling was that if King Lear were like 15 or 20 acts long, eventually it would get funny. In some Samuel Beckett way, but okay, that's you had a writing back up there, yeah. Very rarely. I mean, the reason I'm doing it in one sitting is that I'm there to find the end. I mean, I'm with it until we get an ending. I really can't stop before the end, right? I mean, and usually it's not very changed, because I find that there's a kind of conceptual run of the poem. Like it starts with one thing, goes through a series of questions or something, and then does a little pivot and ends up in some other direction. That whole thing is done in one sitting. The rhetorical run of the poem. Now, the next day or a couple of days, I'll try to make it better, but I don't mess with the structure of it. That's pretty much cooked in the first session. What I do is not so much revision as refinement, and I'm trying to make the poem sound better and move better. So I'm paying attention to cadence and to music, right? So I try to get a good, even though I'm not rhyming at the ends of lines, I'm still writing with my ear to some extent. You know, in that poem about the poem "The Lanyard," I mentioned by a deep Adirondack lake. That's got a nice sound to it, right? By a deep Adirondack lake. And so, you know, I went to Grant Camp in the Catskills, but quite frankly, but Catskills is like blah blah, you know. It's called a spondy. It's just two accented syllables, Catskills. Whereas Adirondack sounds almost Italian, Adirondacks. So that kind of thing, you know, making it jump a little better, yeah.
One more question?
Okay. Who said that? Oh, you did. Okay. So one of the, all right. Well, how about make it a good one? One book that has. Okay. Well, I could say no, but the book, a book that really was a big influence on me is a book called The Poetics of Space, and it's by a very wiggy French critic, philosopher, whatever. He's dead now, Gaston Bachelard. And I'd recommend that book to everybody. It's about spaces. It's about enclosures. It's about kids making little forts with sofa cushions, about children going under the stairs and hiding in a closet. It's about all these hiding places that children have, especially only children, and how this is where the imagination of the child is formed in these, he calls them felicitous spaces, these happy enclosures. And it's like topophilia, the love of places, you know, and he examines that. He examines nests and drawers and cupboards and all sorts. It's fascinating. Gaston Bachelard, yeah. Well, thank you. So that's an educational thing, right? All right, thanks a lot.